What happens when two people spend 40 years waiting for retirement, only to realize they no longer know how to live together once it finally arrives? Margaret Ellis was 82 years old when she first admitted to herself that something inside her marriage had quietly disappeared. Not love, not loyalty, something harder to explain. For most of her life, she and her husband Harold had lived by routine. Wake up early, drink coffee in silence, go to work, pay bills, raise children, attend church on Sundays, fall asleep in front of the television. It wasn't exciting, but it felt safe. Harold had spent nearly 50 years working as a railroad engineer in Ohio. He believed in structure, predictability, quiet discipline. Margaret had once been a school librarian, soft-spoken, patient, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and always kept extra blankets folded neatly in the closet. Their marriage had never been loud, no dramatic fights, no passionate love stories either. Just years layered carefully on top of each other, like old wallpaper nobody bothered removing. When Harold finally retired at 74, everyone told them the same thing. You two can finally enjoy life now. Margaret smiled every time she heard it, but secretly, she felt nervous, because Harold had never really been home before, not fully. For decades, his work schedules had controlled their lives. Early mornings, overnight shifts, long hours away from home. She had built her own rhythm around his absence. Now suddenly, he was always there. At first, it almost felt sweet. They ate breakfast together every morning. They watched old Western movies in the afternoons. Sometimes Harold even reached for her hand while sitting on the porch, small things he never used to do. Their daughter Claire noticed it during her visits. "You both seem happier," she said once while helping Margaret wash dishes. Margaret looked toward the living room where Harold was asleep in his chair. "I think we're still learning each other," she answered softly. And she believed that, for a little while. But retirement changes people in ways nobody warns you about, especially men who spent their whole identity working. Harold slowly became restless. At first, it showed up in tiny ways. He criticized how Margaret folded laundry, complained about grocery prices, asked strange questions about why certain cabinets were organized wrong. Margaret tried laughing it off. "You survived 50 years without caring where I kept the sugar," she joked once. But Harold didn't laugh. "I'm just saying there should be a better system." The tension grew slowly, like a leak behind a wall, invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. He started following her around the house, correcting small things. The thermostat, the television volume, how long she spoke on the phone with Claire. Sometimes he stood silently in doorways watching her cook. Not angry, just there, watching. Margaret didn't know why it unsettled her so much. Maybe because the house no longer felt like hers. One evening, she sat alone in the bedroom, folding towels, while Harold watched television downstairs. And suddenly, she realized something painful. She missed him. Not the retired version, sitting downstairs every day. The old version. The man who used to leave for work before sunrise. The man she used to wait for. Distance had once protected parts of their marriage. Now, there was nowhere to hide. Maybe you have felt this too. Sometimes closeness reveals things distance kept invisible. Their son Michael noticed changes too. During a family dinner, Harold snapped at Margaret for overcooking the roast. The room went quiet. It wasn't what he said, it was how quickly he said it. Sharp, cold. Margaret stared down at her plate while Claire changed the subject. Later that night, Michael quietly helped his mother dry dishes. "Dad okay?" he asked carefully. Margaret forced a smile. "He's just adjusting." But inside, she wasn't sure anymore. Because Harold wasn't just adjusting to retirement. He was grieving something. His purpose, his identity, and somehow, Margaret had become the closest target for all his frustration. The hardest part wasn't the criticism, it was the silence afterward. Harold rarely apologized. Instead, he disappeared into newspapers, television, or long naps in his chair. The house became heavy with unspoken things. Margaret began staying awake later at night just to enjoy the quiet after Harold went to bed. She started drinking tea alone in the kitchen around midnight. Sometimes she simply sat there listening to the refrigerator hum, enjoying the feeling of being alone for a few minutes. One night, Harold walked in unexpectedly. "You coming to bed?" he asked. "In a little while." He stood there awkwardly, then nodded. As he turned away, Margaret suddenly saw something unfamiliar in him. Loneliness. Real loneliness. It startled her, because she realized they were both sitting inside the same sadness, just expressing it differently. At this age, people think marriage problems disappear, but sometimes retirement removes all the distractions that once protected a relationship from itself. A few months later, Harold suffered a minor fall while cleaning the garage. Nothing serious, just a bruised hip, but it shook him deeply. For the first time, Margaret saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of pain, fear of becoming useless. During his recovery, he became quieter, less critical. One rainy afternoon, Margaret brought him soup while he sat near the window. "You don't have to hover over me," he muttered. "I know. Then why are you?" Margaret sat down slowly across from him, and before she could stop herself, the truth came out. "Because I don't know how to reach you anymore." The room went completely still. Harold stared at the steam rising from the soup bowl. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, "I don't know who I am without work." Margaret felt tears press against her eyes instantly. Not because the words surprised her, because after years of tension, it was the first honest thing either of them had said in a very long time. Harold's confession stayed in Margaret's mind for days. "I don't know who I am without work." Such a simple sentence. But after 58 years of marriage, she realized how rarely they had ever spoken honestly about fear. Not practical things, not bills or schedules or doctor appointments. Real fear. The kind people hide even from the person sleeping beside them. After that rainy afternoon, something subtle shifted inside the house. Not a miracle, not sudden happiness, just softness. Harold stopped correcting every little thing she did. Margaret stopped avoiding the living room in the evenings. Sometimes healing begins quietly, like ice melting so slowly you barely notice the sound. One morning, Margaret woke before sunrise and found Harold already sitting in the kitchen. That used to be his old work routine. Coffee before dawn, newspaper folded beside him. Only now there was nowhere for him to go. The sight suddenly broke her heart. He looked smaller somehow, older, not physically, emotionally. Harold glanced up awkwardly. Couldn't sleep. Margaret nodded and started making toast. Neither spoke for a while. Then Harold surprised her. "You remember our trip to Tennessee?" Margaret blinked. "The cabin near the lake?" "Yeah," she smiled faintly. "That was 1987. Harold gave a quiet laugh. "Car broke down halfway there. And you refused to ask for directions. I was stubborn. You still are." For the first time in months, they both smiled naturally. Tiny moments like that began happening more often. Memories became safer to talk about than the present. Maybe because memories couldn't disappoint them anymore. One afternoon, their granddaughter Sophie visited from Columbus. 26 years old, loud laugh, always carrying iced coffee everywhere she went. She hugged Margaret tightly before sitting beside Harold. "You look bored, Grandpa." "I'm retired," he muttered. "That's not the same thing." Margaret watched Harold carefully. Most younger people intimidated him now. The world moved too fast for him these days. Phones, apps, new slang. But Sophie never made him feel outdated. "You should get a hobby," she said. "At 83? Especially at 83. Harold scoffed softly. But later that evening, Margaret caught him browsing old woodworking magazines in the garage. It was strange watching him try to rediscover himself, like watching someone search through old boxes in an attic, unsure what still mattered. Weeks passed. The tension in the house eased slightly, but underneath it, another problem quietly remained. They no longer knew how to talk deeply to each other. For years, their marriage had functioned through routine, not vulnerability. Now, retirement forced them into emotional territory neither understood. One evening, Margaret tried opening up. "I've been feeling lonely too," she admitted, while folding blankets. Harold looked confused. "You're lonely? I'm here all day." "That's not what I mean." He frowned immediately, defensive. "Then what do you mean?" Margaret almost gave up right there, because this was how it always happened. Feelings turned into misunderstandings within minutes. But this time, she stayed calm. We forgot how to be companions. Harold stared silently at the television. The words clearly unsettled him. Finally, he muttered, "I provided for this family my whole life." Margaret softened instantly. "I know you did." "No, you don't understand." His voice cracked slightly. "Everything I knew how to do disappeared when I retired." The sadness in his face startled her again. For decades, she had seen Harold as emotionally strong, unshakable, but now she realized something painful. Many men from his generation were never taught how to exist emotionally outside of work. Nobody prepared them for aging. Nobody taught them how to talk about loss without anger. Later that night, Margaret sat awake beside the bedroom window while Harold slept. Rain tapped softly against the glass. She thought about all the years they spent surviving life instead of understanding each other. Children, mortgages, funerals, hospital visits, work schedules. There was always something demanding attention. And now, suddenly, there was only silence. At this age, silence becomes very loud. A few days later, Margaret suggested they take short evening walks together. Harold resisted immediately. "My hip still bothers me." "You need movement." "I move enough." "You move between the recliner and the refrigerator." He looked offended. Margaret almost laughed at his expression. Eventually, he agreed. Their first walk barely lasted 10 minutes. Harold complained the entire time. About his knees, about the weather, about teenagers driving too fast through the neighborhood. But something unexpected happened. When they returned home, the atmosphere felt lighter. The next evening, they walked again, then again. Slowly, the walks became routine. Sometimes they barely spoke. Sometimes Harold randomly pointed at old houses and told stories Margaret had never heard before, like the time he almost quit the railroad at 32, or the coworker who died suddenly one winter morning. Stories he had apparently carried silently for decades. Margaret listened carefully. And for the first time in years, Harold seemed relieved to be heard instead of judged. One evening during their walk, they passed an elderly couple sitting quietly on a porch swing. The woman rested her head gently against the man's shoulder. Nothing dramatic, just comfort. Harold stared at them for a moment before looking away. That night in bed, he suddenly asked, "Do you think we wasted our marriage?" Margaret turned toward him slowly. The question hung painfully in the dark room. "No," she whispered. "Sometimes I do." Her chest tightened instantly. Harold continued staring at the ceiling. "I spent so much time working overtime. I missed things." Margaret stayed quiet, because he was right. He had missed birthdays, school plays, anniversaries. Not because he didn't love them, because he believed providing financially was love. A lot of people from their generation believed that. "You know what scares me?" Harold asked softly. "What?" "That I waited my whole life to finally rest, and now I don't know what to do with myself." Margaret reached for his hand carefully beneath the blanket. His fingers trembled slightly when he held hers back. Small moments matter more after 80. People stop pretending time is endless. The following Sunday, Claire invited them for dinner. Halfway through the meal, Margaret noticed something unusual. Harold was laughing. Not polite smiling, real laughing. Sophie had shown him some ridiculous video on her phone involving a dancing goat wearing pajamas. Harold laughed so hard he started coughing. Everyone at the table burst into laughter too. Margaret sat quietly watching him, and suddenly tears filled her eyes without warning. Because for months she'd been mourning the man she thought retirement destroyed. But maybe he wasn't gone. Maybe he was simply lost. And maybe they both still had time to find each other again. The winter after Harold turned 83 was colder than usual. Snow covered the sidewalks for weeks. The neighborhood became quiet, still. The kind of silence that makes every clock inside the house sound louder. Margaret noticed Harold slowing down more during those months. Not dramatically, just little things. Taking longer to stand up from his chair, holding the railing tighter when climbing stairs, forgetting small details during conversations. At first, she told herself it was normal aging. After all, they were both in their 80s now. But deep inside, something uneasy had started growing. One afternoon, Harold walked into the kitchen looking confused. "Have you seen my wallet?" Margaret pointed toward the counter. "It's right there." He stared at it for several seconds before nodding slowly. Oh, tiny moment, tiny pause. But it stayed with her all day. A week later, he forgot the route home from the pharmacy, only for a few minutes. But Harold had driven those roads for decades. When he finally returned home, he looked shaken. "I took the wrong turn." Margaret tried staying calm. "It happens." But Harold slammed his keys onto the table harder than necessary. "No, it doesn't." That night, neither of them slept well. Fear changes the atmosphere inside a marriage instantly, especially at their age, because older couples understand something younger people try to ignore. One serious illness can change everything overnight. A few days later, Margaret gently suggested a doctor appointment. Harold resisted immediately. "I'm fine. It's just a checkup." I said I'm fine. The old defensiveness returned quickly. Only this time, it wasn't about retirement. It was fear of losing independence, fear of becoming fragile, fear of needing help. Margaret understood all of it, because secretly, she was afraid too. Maybe you've noticed this in older couples. Sometimes arguments are not really about the argument itself. Sometimes they are about terror nobody wants to name out loud. The tension between them slowly returned. Harold became irritable again. Margaret became quieter. One evening during dinner, Harold suddenly snapped because she cut his meat into smaller pieces. "I can still use a knife, Margaret." She froze instantly. "I was only trying to help." "Well, stop." The words hit harder than they should have. Not because of anger, because of humiliation. Harold pushed his plate away and stared toward the television without speaking. Margaret quietly carried both dishes to the sink. But later that night, while brushing her teeth, she suddenly began crying. Softly at first, then uncontrollably. Not because she blamed Harold, because she realized aging was slowly turning both of them into strangers again. Only this time, the enemy wasn't retirement. It was time itself. Harold found her sitting on the edge of the bed afterward, her eyes red. "What's wrong?" Margaret laughed weakly through tears. "We are." Harold looked stunned. She rarely spoke that directly. "I'm tired, Harold." He sat down slowly beside her. "I know." "No, you don't." Her voice trembled. "I'm tired of pretending we're not scared." The room became painfully quiet. Margaret stared down at her hands. "I'm scared every time you forget something." Harold looked away immediately. "I'm scared every time you fall asleep in that chair and don't move for too long." Still silence. "And I'm scared," she whispered, "that one day, one of us will wake up alone." Harold's face collapsed emotionally in a way she had never seen before. At 83 years old, the man finally looked vulnerable. Not proud, not stubborn, just human. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Harold quietly admitted, "I've been forgetting things more often." Margaret closed her eyes slowly. Hearing him say it out loud somehow made it more real. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because once you say things out loud," his voice cracked, "they become real." Margaret reached for his hand. This time he held on tightly. The doctor appointment happened the following week. The drive there felt strangely heavy, like both of them already knew life was changing before anyone confirmed it. The doctor was kind, patient. After several tests, he explained Harold showed signs of mild cognitive decline. Not severe dementia, not yet, but enough to monitor carefully. Margaret listened quietly while Harold stared at the floor. The ride home was silent. When they entered the house, Harold went directly to the garage without saying anything. Margaret found him sitting alone on an old stool beside dusty woodworking tools. For a moment, he looked like a lost little boy. "I used to know exactly how everything worked," he whispered. Margaret's chest tightened painfully. The trains, the schedules, engines, repairs, numbers. He shook his head slowly. "Now I walk into rooms and forget why I'm there." Margaret sat beside him quietly. Aging humbles people in cruel ways, especially people who built their identity around competence. That evening, Harold did something unexpected. He opened an old wooden box hidden on a garage shelf. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Their wedding day, Claire as a child holding a fishing pole, Michael wearing a Halloween costume, Margaret, much younger, laughing beside a lake. Harold picked up one faded photo carefully. "You were beautiful." Margaret smiled softly. "I still am." Harold looked at her for 2 seconds, then laughed quietly. "There you are," she whispered. "What?" "That version of you." He stared down at the photographs again. "I think I lost him for a while." Margaret touched his shoulder gently. "No," she said softly. "I think you were just afraid." That night, they stayed awake until nearly 2 in the morning, going through old memories together. Not perfectly. Sometimes Harold forgot names, dates, details. But Margaret noticed something important. The more emotionally connected he felt, the calmer he became. Fear had isolated him. Connection softened him. At one point, Harold looked toward her quietly. "You know what retirement really did?" "What?" "It forced me to finally sit still long enough to realize how much of our life I missed while chasing work." Margaret didn't answer immediately, because part of her still carried sadness about that too. But another part understood something now. People can spend decades loving each other imperfectly and still find their way back emotionally near the end. Before bed, Harold stopped beside the hallway mirror. He stared at his reflection for a long moment, then quietly asked, "Do you ever wish you married someone easier?" Margaret walked closer slowly. "No." "Why not?" She smiled sadly. "Because even after all these years, you still feel like home to me." Harold lowered his eyes instantly, and Margaret realized something she had not felt in a very long time. Peace. Not perfect happiness, not certainty, just peace inside the truth of who they had become together. Spring arrived slowly that year. The snow melted, flowers returned to front porches, children rode bicycles through the neighborhood again. Life moved forward quietly, even as Harold's memory continued changing little by little. Some mornings he repeated questions. Sometimes he forgot appointments. Once he called their granddaughter Sophie by Claire's name. The mistakes hurt him more than anyone else. Margaret could see it immediately each time confusion crossed his face. Like watching someone slowly lose pieces of themselves while fully aware it's happening. But something else changed too. Harold became softer, more affectionate, as if fear had finally stripped away the emotional walls he carried most of his life. One morning, Margaret woke up and found a folded note beside her coffee cup. In shaky handwriting, Harold had written, "Thank you for staying." She stood in the kitchen holding that small piece of paper for nearly 5 minutes, crying silently. Because after 60 years of marriage, those were words she had needed long before retirement ever came. Sometimes people love deeply, but speak it too late. Still, late can matter. The evening walks continued through spring. Slower now, shorter, but meaningful. Harold often forgot what day it was, yet somehow he always remembered to reach for Margaret's hand before crossing the street. One evening they sat together on a park bench, watching the sunset turn the sky orange. Harold looked unusually thoughtful. "You know something strange?" he asked. "What?" "I spent most of my life thinking retirement would feel like freedom." Margaret listened quietly. "But freedom isn't what people need most." "What is?" He looked toward her slowly. "Connection." The simplicity of the answer nearly broke her heart, because for decades they had both mistaken survival for closeness. At this age, people begin understanding what actually mattered all along. Not the overtime hours, not bigger houses, not perfect routines, just presence, just love expressed before time runs out. A few weeks later, Claire invited the family for a small Sunday gathering. Nothing fancy, just hamburgers in the backyard. Michael came with his wife. Sophie arrived carrying one of her ridiculous iced coffees again. The family laughed more easily these days, maybe because everyone sensed time differently now. Harold sat quietly watching his grandchildren talk while sunlight filtered through the trees. Margaret noticed tears forming in his eyes. "You okay?" she whispered. He nodded slowly. "I wasted so much time worrying about work." Margaret squeezed his hand gently. "You gave your family stability, but I should have given more of myself." Margaret looked at him carefully. The old Harold would never have admitted something like that. Not in front of people, not even privately. Aging had humbled him, but strangely, it had also made him emotionally braver. Later that afternoon, Sophie sat beside Margaret on the porch swing. "You and Grandpa seem closer lately," she said softly. Margaret smiled faintly. "We almost had to lose each other before we finally slowed down enough to really see each other." Sophie leaned her head gently against her grandmother's shoulder. "That's sad." Margaret stared toward Harold, laughing quietly with Michael near the grill. "No," she whispered after a moment. "It's human." That night, after everyone left, Harold seemed unusually tired. Margaret helped him into bed. As she adjusted the blanket, Harold suddenly held her wrist gently. "Stay for a minute." She sat beside him quietly. The bedroom lamp cast soft yellow light across the room they had shared for almost 6 decades. Harold stared at the ceiling for a while before speaking. "You know what I regret most?" Margaret expected him to mention work again, or missed birthdays, or overtime shifts. But instead, he said, "All the years I assumed you already knew how much I loved you." Margaret immediately covered her mouth to stop herself from crying, because she had known, and yet hearing it mattered anyway, very deeply. Harold turned toward her carefully. "I wasn't good at saying things." "I know. My father never said emotional things either." Margaret nodded slowly. That generation of men carried love differently, quietly, practically, sometimes invisibly. But invisible love can accidentally create lonely marriages. Harold squeezed her hand weakly. "If I could do it again, I would sit with you more." Margaret smiled through tears. "You're sitting with me now." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. No television, no distractions, no rushing. Just two elderly people finally understanding what marriage was supposed to feel like all along. Weeks later, Margaret found herself standing alone in the kitchen one early morning while Harold still slept upstairs. Sunlight touched the curtains softly. Coffee brewed quietly. And suddenly she realized something surprising. She no longer feared retirement the way she once had. Yes, it had changed their marriage completely, but not only in painful ways. Retirement had stripped away distractions. It exposed wounds, loneliness, distance, regret. But it also forced honesty into places where silence once lived. For the first time in decades, they stopped behaving like coworkers surviving life together and started becoming companions again. Not perfect companions, not youthful lovers, just two aging souls learning each other one final time before the end of the road. Maybe you have felt this too. At this age, love looks different. It becomes quieter, softer, less about excitement, more about presence, more about who still reaches for your hand after the world has taken nearly everything else away. That evening, Margaret and Harold sat together on the porch while rain rolled gently across the street. Neither spoke for a while. Then Harold smiled faintly and asked, "What do you think happens after all this?" Margaret looked toward the rain. "I don't know." Harold nodded slowly, then rested his head gently against her shoulder. "But I hope," he whispered, "we find each other there too." Margaret closed her eyes, and for the first time in many years, the silence between them no longer felt empty.